need, the Stimson Center, I'm really happy that we are launching today the Climate and Ocean Risk Vulnerability Index, or what we call CORVI. So CORVI is a new tool which compares a diverse range of risks at the city level, to produce a coastal city risk profile. So this information is really designed to help coastal cities and small island developing states and emerging economies to really pinpoint the actions to reduce risk and access badly needed capital. So before I introduce our panel, I want to thank our generous sponsors of the CORVI project, AXA XL, Bloomberg Philanthropies, and the Ocean Policy Research Institute of the Sasakawa Peace Foundation. So thank you to all of them. So for our panel, we have a very impressive panel lined up to discuss climate risk and resilience for coastal communities, both here at home and also abroad. So let me introduce our panelists, and to get their full bios, which are super impressive, please go to our event page. Alice Hill, who will moderate today's discussion, is a senior fellow for climate change policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. Alice recently published a book called Building a Resilient Tomorrow: How to Prepare for the Coming Climate Disruption. We also have Andrew McFarlane, who is the head of pricing and analytics at AXA XL and a partner on AXA XL's Leadership Council. Karen Florini has joined us. Karen is the vice president for programs at Climate Central. And then we also have Nicole LeBoeuf. Nicole is the acting assistant administrator at NOAA's National Ocean Service. And one more sort of housekeeping thing. Before I turn it over to our moderator, I want to remind everyone that after our discussion, there'll be an opportunity for questions and answers. So if you want to write a question to one of our panelists, you need to use the function marked host, okay? Marked host. Host will get to us. If you send in elsewhere, we won't see it. So please use the function marked host. And with that, let me now turn it over to our moderator, Alice, who will really set the stage on the importance of climate resilience in coastal communities. Alice.
Thanks so much, Sally, and thank you to all of you joining us here today. It will be a very interesting discussion. You know, I saw the other day a headline, and the headline read, "It's not the news that it's climate change, it's the pace." And it certainly feels, even in the midst of the terrible stress and strain that our country is facing, the global pandemic, that extreme weather events are on the rise. Sally alluded to some of those occurring. Just imagine what India has been through. India, in the midst of COVID, a very densely populated country, has had on its eastern coast just recently a cyclone. Also, cyclones hit the Philippines and Bangladesh. And now another cyclone is bearing down for the first time in a century on the western coast to the city of Mumbai, also a very densely populated business center for the country. These kinds of events stress everyone, including even more so during a time of COVID. So we need to begin to think, how will we possibly be resilient to these types of events? Unfortunately, we are now just beginning the hard work of truly building resilience. Of course, we need to continue to cut our emissions in the face of climate change to avoid the very worst impacts that are ahead. But the coastal cities will be particularly impacted, and many of our megacities are located along our coasts. They can anticipate higher storm surge that allows water to go more deeply into the land. It also affects fresh water supplies, and they can expect just more flooding, sunny day flooding, as the sea levels rise. A recent study concluded that storm surges are now 8 inches higher than they were in 1900. That means that we're seeing much more water already inland, and we can expect more water in the future. That translates into eroding beaches, destruction of infrastructure, the loss of more homes, and obviously more people on the move as their homes and livelihoods are destroyed. Sally alluded to, these impacts affect millions and millions, hundreds of millions of people. And as seas rise, it'll affect even more. The essential question is, how can we have better outcomes? We can't stop the seas rising. Many of these impacts, including continued sea rise, are already baked in. They're from our past emissions. So even though we are enjoying, in the midst of the pandemic, clear skies, clean air, we still see a huge accumulation of emissions that will cause further warming in the decades ahead. So we will need help. The cities will need help with financing, insurance, learning better building practices, land use choices, and of course, emergency management to help when the bad storms do strike. You name it, they will need it. To obtain that kind of help, there's a need to understand the vulnerabilities. What is the true risk? In that area, getting the right data and information still remains a challenge. We simply don't have downscaled data for many parts of the world, although you'll hear from Karen that Climate Central has made tremendous inroads in our understandings of elevation in combination with sea level rise. But we just don't have the information yet at the granularity we need or in the formats that are useful to the people who need to make the decisions. We need that granularity so that we can quantify the risk, so that we can incentivize better decisions earlier, so that we can build the necessary political will to support reducing risk. And all of this requires tools. So that's the exciting topic of our conversation today. What can we do in the face of this speeding crisis? Stimson Center is launching today a new tool, and I believe that it could make a difference. It will make a difference in how coastal cities can assess, and others can assess, the risks that those cities face, from climate change, as well as what the cities could do about reducing those risks. So with that, I want to turn now to our first expert, Sally. You've already heard from her, to ask her a question. We will then have questions and answer from each of our panelists. But as Sally said, we very much hope that you join in this discussion. So please do find that host button and start asking your questions. We would like to make this as a dialogue as much as possible during these unusual times of not being able to meet in person. So with that, I will turn to Sally. I want to ask you, we're here obviously to talk about risk and vulnerability. Can you tell us more about this new tool you're launching? What exactly will it do to better identify and manage coastal risks at the city level?
Thank you, Alice. Thank you for that great introduction and question. So as I said in my introduction, CORVI is a new tool, and it's been developed by the Stimson Center, and it assesses climate and ocean risks, again, at the city level. So this information can be really used by decision makers across governments, international organizations, and the private sector, and it's really supposed to drive investment into those most vulnerable areas. So why did we focus on the cities? Well, as most everyone I'm sure knows on this webinar, the recent IPCC report made really clear that coastal cities are at risk. They are facing, as you noted, Alice, rising sea levels, increased storm intensity, and warmer temperatures. But at the same time, many cities in developing countries are already grappling with underlying economic and social issues, poverty, inequality, high levels of unemployment, outdated infrastructure, poor governance, and even at times corruption. And so as the impacts of climate change increase, the intersection of all of these social, economic, and environmental issues may in fact leave governments in developing cities unable to provide some of the basic services and protections that their citizens need. So in these circumstances, this can also lead to social tension and potentially instability. So there are a lot of examples around the world which we could touch on where climate change is combining with social issues to increase vulnerability of the city residents. In Jakarta, Indonesia, for example, home to almost 11 million people, they have extreme rainfall, which has led to widespread flooding. And then in addition, they have extensive groundwater extraction, and rising sea levels have really increased the risk of storm surge. And this is to such an extent that Indonesia's president last year announced that he wants to move the capital from Jakarta to neighboring island of Borneo. I mean, imagine the disruption and the dislocation and the economic issues affecting people's lives. So as you can see on this slide, climate risk is commonly understood as a function of hazard. So that's the physical threat, like the hurricane. Exposure, that's the exposure to the assets at risk, like the homes, the businesses, or the infrastructure, and how will they be affected. And then there's vulnerability, understanding how prepared communities are for these cascading effects that I've talked about when an event hits. So as Alice noted, global data sets, have improved, and we have better high resolution data on hazard and exposure. It's more readily available, but accessing high resolution vulnerability data still remains a major challenge. And so CORVI is really trying to fill that need by mapping city level vulnerability through a bottom-up approach and process. So as you can see on the CORVI wheel that we have highlighted here, there are three major types of risk: ecological, financial, and political risk. And these risks are then broken up into 10 categories, 10 risk categories. And under those 10 categories, we have close to 100 sub-risk indicators. Every category and indicator are on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 indicating the greatest risk. And then these scores are relative, this is important, are relative to other coastal cities in a region. And that really gives the decision maker the kind of granular data on the level of vulnerability in each risk category. So many of you know that city level data is improving, but it remains sparse. So despite this, decision makers, as Alice noted, we can't really wait for perfect data. We need to make informed investment decisions now if cities are to effectively build resilience. So to overcome this challenge, CORVI uses a combination of empirical and survey data. So to accomplish this, what we do is we interview experts in each category in coastal cities, which when combined with the empirical data makes up what I noted earlier as a final city risk profile. So again, to reiterate, this risk profile is a holistic assessment of climate and ocean risk, and it's designed to really provide information to decision makers across governments, financial institutions, and development agencies, and help them target investment into high risk areas so they can access capital where it is needed most. So that is CORVI in a big nutshell. Thank you.
There we go. I'm unmuted. I really appreciate that background. In my work, one of the things I think in the decade I've been looking at this is that we've certainly deepened our understanding of climate risk, but there always seems to be a sense we just need more. We just need more before we can make a decision about what to do. So there's a lot more thought than action. Tell us how you believe this tool will or has already changed that paradigm, how it can help move those in charge to actually make the decisions that need to be made to build resilience to the impacts that they're already suffering and will suffer in the foreseeable future?
Great question. Yeah, what I'd like to do, let me talk about some of our case studies. I think that will be really illustrative as to how the CORVI tool works and what we've started to find. So we've completed risk profiles, for example, in the cities of Castries, St. Lucia, and Kingston, Jamaica. And it's interesting, these two case studies really tell a slightly different story. And for folks who want to learn more about it, it's all on our website to get greater detail. But in Castries, St. Lucia, for example, the CORVI risk profile shows that vulnerability is greater under ecological and financial risk, specifically in the economics, ecosystems, and climate categories. These category scores were driven by high indicator scores related to unemployment, loss of coral reef coverage, and extreme heat events. And as you can see, CORVI scores in the political risk area were generally lower, and this was driven by a confidence in the rule of law and civil society engagement indicators. Urban and youth unemployment, inequality, and a large informal economy contributed to high financial risk scores. Tourism, as everyone knows, is really a critical industry for Castries, employing about 40% of the Castries population and even greater in the informal economy. However, risk scores for this industry were determined to be at the medium level of risk because we compare it to other cities in the region, many of which were even more dependent on tourism. Under the ecological risk scores, the ecosystems and climate categories were high due to losses in the national coral reef and mangrove coverage, a high number of heat events, and the number of people by extreme weather. And when we went on the ground, this was confirmed by experts. They told us about how the importance of mangroves and corals were, as well as the danger of extreme heat events to the tourist industry. So tourism, obviously, as I noted, is a pivotal part of their economy, but it also has unforeseen negative consequences. For example, unregulated construction and pollution from a lack of effective waste management have negatively impacted the health of the coast. And finally, for Castries, there's a lack of renewable energy generation. They have a dependence on oil imports and extensive coastal development and poor road conditions. And all of this contributed to critical infrastructure risks. Earlier this week, the Prime Minister of St. Lucia, he really sounded the alarm, highlighting how his country is facing significant shrinking tourist revenues due to COVID at a time when they are about to accelerate their climate resilience needs and as the current hurricane season begins. I mean, it's a worry. Now let me turn, if I could, to Kingston for a minute. So the CORVI assessment in Kingston identified a different set of issues of concern. As you can see, risk scores are spread across a number of medium risk categories. So CORVI results show that Kingston risks to climate change are diversified across multiple categories. And as you can see in the numbers, they're relatively similar at the category level. However, when we drill down into the specific indicators, certain risk areas actually pop out. For instance, under the ecosystem category, ecosystem services such as coral reefs, seagrass beds, and mangrove forests all scored high. Local experts noted to us that this risk is concentrated around the Kingston's International Airport, where mangrove removal has heightened the risk of flooding, both for the airport and the two-lane road that connects the city. And while recent mangrove replanting has started and helped, this risk still really remains. Under the financial risk, the urban unemployment and debt ratio indicators scored high. Informal housing construction also scored at a high risk. So while this indicator measures national levels of informal settlements, local experts did note to us that unregulated construction has occurred in really key watersheds areas, which increases flood risk in the city of Kingston. And finally, under political risk, the governance category score was higher than average by a lack of confidence in the role of government and transparency, and both of these indicators measure perceptions of individual safety. But on the other hand, there are lower risk scores were recorded in civil society engagement and national climate adaptation planning. And these indicators measure the perception of how well the Jamaican government is doing to enact effective climate adaptation policies. And this kind of leadership can really be seen in the government's Vision 2030 report, which identifies hazard risk reduction and adaptation to climate change as a critical area for their action. So these first risk profiles that I've just highlighted really demonstrate the value which CORVI can add by providing a holistic assessment of financial and non-financial risk at the city level. And in 2020 and 2021, we're expanding fast. This year, we have expanded to East Africa, the Pacific region, and we're building new regional data sets. We're creating profiles in Mombasa, Kenya, Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, and Suva, Fiji. We're also working with partners to further expand to cities in Bangladesh, Philippines, and Belize. So just again, to finish what you asked, I just want to reiterate the value of CORVI. At a time when financial resources are tight and the climate emergency is on us, we have developed a tool that will provide a level of granularity on the climate vulnerability facing cities. This type of information can really help decision makers pinpoint their areas of action, gain access to capital while providing a level of confidence to the investors that funds are being used wisely, and most importantly, being used for safety and security of the city residents. Thank you.
And thoughtful approach that you've had in terms of determining which factors to look at. I want to turn to Andy McFarland now. You have been in the insurance and reinsurance world. Certainly the reinsurers have led, particularly the European reinsurers, in ringing the alarm bells about how significant climate risk can be going forward. How do you see the insurance industry, reinsurers, primary insurance companies using this tool to inform their work?
Thanks, Alice, and thank you for the opportunity to be part of this panel, and equally for sort of AXA XL to be a key sponsor and contributor to the development of this index. As Sally had sort of represented, I wanted to spend a little bit of time just talking about the definition of risk. I think sometimes within the context of risk, there's a confusion sometimes between hazard and risk. And so just to reiterate the importance when we think about risk in the industry, in the insurance industry and reinsurance industry, we split out into those key components that Sally had referenced before, and vulnerability is obviously a key part of that. And as Sally and yourself, Alice, has sort of articulated, vulnerability is one of the hardest parts of that equation to understand. So the advances that we've seen on the science and to understand the hazards, there is improving ways in which we get to understand exposure more and more through satellite imagery, the ability for machine learning to run over those satellite images and improve the information that we can use at that granular level, model the risk. Those are all areas and advances that have been made. Vulnerability relies a lot on losses that we've seen, specific issues, building codes, geography of particular areas to understand the full view of risk. And when we think about risk, obviously, as an insurer and reinsurer, the area that we're mostly focused on is around climate. And so, looking at CORVI and the areas and the aspects that CORVI has highlighted in the climate area, it will definitely help and provide us with some insights into those particular issues and areas that those cities are exposed to. Obviously, the granularity point is a very important one, and when we think about risk, going down to that very granular level helps us to understand it more. And so city levels, I think, helps develop some of the narrative that we'll talk about in the next slide. But the index certainly provides and will help us to develop some thoughts and work that we're doing around some of the key issues around natural assets. So Sally's mentioned Sally mentioned coral reefs, mangroves, coastal marshes. All those are important parts of resilience that insurance companies and coastal communities need to value even more. And so we are extending and doing further work in this area to try and understand the importance of these type of natural assets. And CORVI will certainly give us an indication and an ability to sort of zero in and focus more for particular cities and particular areas around those natural assets.
So much. That's very helpful to understand how you're thinking about using this tool. One of the things I hear frequently in my own work is the insurance companies are going to solve this for us. They're going to be able to figure out how to have cities be resilient or individuals be resilient, and it will take care of itself. Of course, as I looked at the scale of the risk, I think that it's beyond any one particular sector or industry to solve this. I'm interested to understand, however, how you see the insurance industry using CORVI to help promote resilience in particular communities. Do you think that's a role that it will play for you?
Absolutely. So for those insurance folks on the call, protection gap might be sort of, I understand that we've got a broad array of participants. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time just defining when we talk about protection gap in the insurance industry, it's really the difference between what you might hear reported under an event. So you might hear losses being reported of 50 billion, 20 billion. Of those 20 billion, not everything is insured, right? Only a portion of that is insured. And so the protection gap is really that portion of a particular loss that goes uninsured and is generally picked up by what we sort of think about as the insurer of last resort, really being governments, local cities, states, those type of things. And so our goal and our thinking around the protection gap is obviously that we want to demonstrate to governments, we want to articulate to governments and those insurers of last resort the ability and the value that insurance and reinsurance can bring to bear on their communities. And so, you know, in work we've done recently with the Cambridge Center for Risk Studies, we have looked at and investigated resilience from an insurance perspective. And it's very clear that those communities and areas which have insurance tend to respond, tend to recover quicker, and their level of recovery tends to be better. So, you know, in terms of providing resilience to communities, insurance and reinsurance has a big part to play. And so the way I sort of think that CORVI can help is really to help some of those dialogues that we can have with governments, local cities, local communities around areas that they are exposed to and areas which they're at risk. Highlight those key areas, and then that allows us then to step in and try and provide and develop solutions for them to meet some of those risks that they are exposed to. So there is an example related back to that natural assets of coral reefs, where I believe one of our competitors, Swiss Re, has developed a coral reef program providing insurance for a coral reef because it provides not only resilience to the coastal communities but tourism, and so that asset, that natural asset, has real value to that community. And if there's a value to something, we can structure a product to try and insure or reinsure it. So, you know, I think one of the key components of this is allowing us to demonstrate those areas that are at risk from the CORVI vulnerability index. It's then also up to us as an industry to demonstrate the value that we bring through insurance. Because I think, as I've got there in the last point, I'm not sure people make the connection between insurance equaling to resilience. You know, insurance is something that people buy, they sort of go through. Generally, you know, 90% of cases are the experience is good. We tend to focus on a lot of the bad experiences. But we've got to remember that insurance is a key component to an economy being able to function and develop and prosper. And so, you know, highlighting the importance of insurance as a mechanism to promote resilience is something that we can use alongside the CORVI index to then facilitate those discussions and try and develop some of those solutions.
Thank you. I couldn't agree with you more. I think insurance does have a very important role to play. In fact, the California Commission of Insurance, the commissioner, Ricardo Lara, has formed a group solely looking at natural solutions, but also others if they're available, for products that the insurance industry could offer to help build resilience, understanding that it's got to be a collaborative effort. So, everybody's got to understand the risk picture, and then what can we do, and what are the products the insurance industry can provide that will lead to better outcomes. So it's exciting to hear that your belief that this tool will help, because that's critical to build as I look at what's ahead, that kind of understanding, and then provision of risk reduction measures that will help communities thrive. I want to turn now to Karen Florini. Karen, last year I remember opening a media announcement about an extraordinary study that Climate Central had done, which showed the very importance factor of getting it right when it comes to data. So could you share a bit about that study, which showed how more vulnerable certain areas in the world were to coastal flooding than we previously believed?
Thanks, Alice. I'm happy to do that. Are you seeing my slides now?
Not yet, I'm not, but
okay,
the others are.
There we go. Okay, there we go. Is it up? Seeing it now?
Yes, they're up.
Terrific. So vulnerability to sea level rise isn't just about the depth of the water. It's also about the height of the land on which the water is rising. Prior to the study that you were mentioning, most folks, when they were looking at this, had used a data set from NASA called the SRTM, which stands for Shuttle Radar Topography Mission. But SRTM doesn't really distinguish between the actual ground and the height of buildings or trees, whatever's highest as it's taking its particular reading. So it has an average error of over 6 feet. We thought that needed to be improved upon. So we used a system where we combined the SRTM data with 53 million data points from the US LIDAR data set, which is of course the state of the art on elevation for coasts. And we used a neural net approach, and we produced a paper published in Nature Communications last October that showed that when you use the improved data set, you found that there were 3 times as many people living on land now that is subject to flooding by 2050. We call this data set Coastal DEM. We did it using an AI neural net approach and machine learning. My very clever colleagues who are computational science experts developed this system. So the result was that when there were when you apply the Coastal DEM approach, by 2050, 300 million people are now living on land that would be subject to annual flooding and 150 million living on land that would be subject to daily flooding, because that's what high tide line is. So we created the coastal dam set, and this is not a subtle distinction when you look at the difference in places like Bangladesh, when you look in places like Mumbai and Hanoi. We created a free online tool that incorporates the coastal dam data. It's called the Coastal Risk Screening Tool, and it's available at coastal.climatecentral.org. And here's some bigger letters that, in case you can't read the small ones in the URL. It lets you compare SRTM results with the coastal dam results for virtually any coastal area in the world. And for the US, it also includes LIDAR data. The screening tool also has a number of other map layers. If you click on Choose Map at the upper left, you can also look by year. So here we have Bangladesh for 2050. The year slider lets you pick decades from 2030 through the end of this century. And you can also then, when you click on Change Other Settings down here, you are able to see the default settings that automatically come up, and you are able to change them. So you can look at sea level rise with an annual flood, that's the default, or with just sea level rise or a decadal flood. You can change the rates of future emissions of heat trapping gases, and at LUC, which means the probability in the mapping found in various models. And if you select the optimistic settings, you get a lot less red, whereas you choose the pessimistic settings, you see a lot more red, red being the inundated land. If you click on the details and limitations, you get an awful lot of background information as well. Again, on the Choose Map, you can also select a water level and set a particular water level to see what is inundated at that level. This is in tenths of a meter. And if you want to download a map, you click on the download button up on the upper right. This takes you to a field that looks like that. You select your map image and get something that looks like this. And in addition, you at that site, same place, you can actually seek to get the coastal dam data layer itself. This is a big data set. We do make it available for free to nonprofits, to academia, and to lower income governments. And it's available for purchase to commercial entities as well.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate the work that went into that. You know, I started my career, at least on climate change, at the Department of Homeland Security, which has FEMA. And FEMA, of course, is responsible for overseeing the flood insurance program, which is, as we know, itself underwater, because we tend to insure a lot of properties that already are at great risk of flooding and keep insuring them again once they flood. So talk me through a little bit about what you've learned about flood risk for US locations. At least in the United States, flood is our greatest and most damaging natural hazard. We have a broken flood insurance program, and we also have mapping provided by the federal flood insurance program through FEMA that is in many instances inaccurate. The maps are old, and they certainly do not yet reflect the future risk of climate change. So even if you think you're outside the flood zone now, you might not be in the outside the flood zone tomorrow. So talk us through what Climate Central can do to help with this big gap in information from the federal government at this point.
Well, we have a number of the features that I've already showed you that exist for the rest of the world are all available for the United States for the mapping tool. In addition, there are several others that are available specifically in the United States. In particular, for the water level, you can click on the Change Other Settings button and see whether you want to look at just land that is protected by levees or not. The default shows up with the levees in place, but if you click on the other button, in effect, the levees go away. And what you see is a darn compelling rationale for investing at levee maintenance, particularly in New Orleans. Another tool that is one that we developed in response to stakeholders who told us that they needed to be able to get specifics on risk for lots of locations in a very efficient way without having to click through the map and download information individually. So we created the Portfolio Analysis Tool, or PAT. It allows users to give us a list of locations up to many thousands at once. We did a sample analysis, and by the way, there are a number of different kinds of folks that we think might find this a useful tool. City resilience officers, for example, but also insurers, bankers, etc. We did a sample analysis for Cape Canaveral and the Kennedy Space Center. The way the system works is the individual locations are identified by drop pins, and then for each of those, it shows the risk of flood events over time. Other tools that we have include our Risk Finder, which combines about 110 different databases, many of them federal, including from our colleagues at NOAA. For every zip code, municipality, county, congressional district, and state, we have long scrolling pages with lots of information. Among other things, it lets you look at what's at risk for various water levels. You select by using the slider over at the left. You can look at demographics and vulnerable populations and racial groups. You can look at particular types of buildings, at various types of infrastructure, Superfund and other contaminated sites. By the way, all of this is available in Spanish as well as English by clicking at the little button over on the bottom left. Another tool is Seeing Choices, which visualizes the amount of sea level rise that could get locked in following certain amounts of warming over time. Here's what Florida looks like under that scenario as global temperatures rise, as you see at the bottom indicator. There's less and less of Florida. And finally, for folks who like images rather than statistics or maps, we have a set of photorealistic images of iconic locations. For example, this is what the Wall Street Bowl looks like now. And this is what it looks like with the amount of sea level rise that would be locked in following a rise of about 4 degrees Celsius. Nothing left but the tail. And we also have slider images showing various amounts of sea level rise. On the live version, this goes, you can take this back and forth. And for some reason, Mar-a-Lago is our most popular one. I should say I've given a very fast overview of some pretty complex tools. We're more than happy to provide any of today's viewers with a more in-depth introduction. We have a number of tools also on a number of helper tools on the sites, but we're also happy to give people a bit more of a guided tour as well.
Thanks so much, Karen. I really just want to say how much I admire your approach and Climate Central's approach. You know, if you want clear communication, I think Climate Central's figured out what needs to be done. And you've recruited meteorologists, others. You provide slides that we can borrow and use in our own talks. So it's just very impressive to see the contribution that your mighty team is making to help all of us better understand really what's at stake. And that's what I want to talk to Nicole about through her work at NOAA. NOAA, of course, has been key in our understanding of coastal risk and is a partner to many communities across the United States in helping them understand what's at stake. So, Nicole, share with us what your view is as to what is at risk here for the U.S. coastal and ocean economies ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Alice, and thank you to Stimson for having me today. Our nation's coastal zone, as we all know, is home and playground for a lot of people, hundreds of millions of people, not just Americans, but people that come from all over the world. That it serves as a key driver for our country's economic health and prosperity. We've been talking today, we've heard a lot today about inequality and disparity around the world. And I want to keep that in mind as we examine what's at risk and what is at stake for a country that has relative economic prosperity. 126 million people live in the US coastal counties. That's about 40% of our nation's population in only just 10% of our land mass. Coastal communities and industries, what we also sometimes call the US blue economy or the marine economy, contribute to our way of life across sectors and in myriad of ways. It impacts our daily lives. And now for the first time, we can put real numbers, they are conservative, it's a beginning step, but real numbers on the contribution of our ocean and coasts to the rest of the US economy. This is what helps us begin to understand what is at stake for the United States. Just yesterday, NOAA, in partnership with the US Bureau of Economic Analysis, released a first of its kind report on the status of our US marine economy. You can see on this slide representation of 10 sectors of the marine economy that were broken down in the analysis. Experts from NOAA and BEA consider these sectors to represent business dependent on our nation's coasts, ocean, and Great Lakes between the years of 2014 and 2018. In this beginning estimate, we found that the US blue economy contributed nearly $373 billion to our nation's GDP in 2018, and that the US blue economy grew faster as a sector than our nation's economy as a whole. Marine-related gross domestic product grew 5.8% just from 2017 to 2018, faster than 5.4% of the total US GDP. These marine-dependent businesses also supported 2.3 million jobs in 2018. Now, I know we don't have time to break down the contributions by sector, but if you'll go to the BEA website, you'll find out all the details about how each of these sectors contribute to the marine economy, but I'm going to give you just a couple. Recreation and tourism, including recreational fishing, contributes $143 billion to the US economy. Transportation and warehousing, $25 billion. Ship and boat building, $9 billion. Professional and technical services, $31 million. It is nearly impossible for most Americans to go a single day without eating, wearing, or using products that come either from or through our coastal communities to our store shelves and into our homes. And as we've been hearing today, it is within this zone, the coastal zone, this hugely influential part of our economy, that we are experiencing increasing hazards like hurricanes and flooding, even sunny day flooding or coastal inundation. Information like we have revealed in these statistics are especially important because it allows us to begin facing the threats of sea level rise and other coastal hazards with dollars and about what is actually at stake. It's a clearer picture for national policymakers, marine industries, investors, insurance companies, and others to be informed about how best to protect our people, economy, and our environment. So we know more about what's at risk, and these are, again, just conservative estimates that we are taking a first step in understanding. And the economics allow us to understand more about vulnerabilities as well, as we've heard already. We do find in our first analysis that there are gaps in our information, so this is a learning process. One of the gaps is the economic risks of weather disasters that we know are increasing. Also, this analysis does not account for benefits provided by natural infrastructure, including storm protection benefits that we all know something about. So just a beginning, we're very pleased to present this information and are looking forward to the next generation of the methodologies.
And all the work that's being done to analyze the really critical role that these coastal communities in the United States play to the health of our economy and just how much people enjoy living near coastal areas. And so that's why we see so many of us there. Let me, I will want to ask you one more question, but for those of you in the audience, I do ask that you send your questions now. We'll have time for a short moderated discussion by Jack Stewart. But let me ask you this, Nicole, what are some of the very top successful strategies that you've seen coastal communities can use to help reduce some of the risks that we've been talking about?
Yeah, thanks, Alice. So there are many strategies that the National Ocean Service lends our expertise to and advises of the public. I will talk just a little bit today about the nature-based infrastructure approaches. Just last week, I led a very well-attended congressional staff briefing on this very topic. There's a lot of interest, I think growing interest, in the support of nature-based infrastructure. And in my view, that's because it works. Nature provides effective solutions for minimizing coastal flooding, as do human-made systems that mimic natural processes. We call this all nature-based solutions, natural infrastructure. And you can see on this slide, there are many different types. These are ones we're all familiar with: wetlands, mangroves, oyster reefs, sand dunes. Some of the man-made versions include permeable pavement and driveways, green roofs, etc. We're still gathering information about the benefits derived from different types of natural infrastructure, but we know, for example, that coastal wetlands in the United States are estimated to provide $23.2 billion in storm protection services each year. Wetlands are amazing. They can absorb 50% of incoming wave energy in just 15 feet of marsh. So pretty impressive. We also know that these approaches are sustainable and they are cost effective. We have a lot of other reasons to advocate for them. One of the ways in which we support the coastal natural infrastructure through our partnership with the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation in the administration of the Coastal Resilience Grant Program. We are providing money to support on-the-ground projects which engage communities and reduce their vulnerability from sea level rise, storms, flooding and erosion, and the other things that you've heard. In fiscal year 2019, the program awarded $30 million in grants for coastal resilience projects across 23 states and US territories. And we are already getting not only positive signals that the projects on the ground are working and are being effective, but we're getting signals from Congress that they'd like to put more of their weight behind these kinds of programs. And I believe that in this situation in the United States, where our economy could really use a kickstart, restoration projects in the building of national infrastructure is a way to put people back to work and provide opportunities for coastal communities to be more resilient into the future.
Thank you. It's really encouraging to hear the emphasis on nature-based solutions. You know, just a few years ago, I remember being in Norfolk, talking to them. They have a very serious sea level rise and land subsidence challenge. And, you know, the first thing you would hear would be build a seawall. But of course, it's fantastic to learn that our thinking about this can evolve, and then to hear Andy reference that there's movement in the insurance industry to figure out how to better insure these kinds of approaches so that we get a much more holistic system for risk reduction. So thank you so much for that. Now I'm going to turn this over to Jack for questions from the audience. Jack, are you there?
Thank you, Alice, and thank you to all the participants for a very interesting discussion. The first question, actually, before I get to the questions, for questions about will the recording be made available afterwards? The answer is yes, the recording of this event will be made available on our website. My first question goes to Alice and Nicole. This question addresses possible trade-off risks. For instance, building a sea wall can reduce the vulnerability and enhance protection, but it also may cause adverse impacts on fisheries, coastal ecosystems, and tourism. How can we balance these trade-offs?
I'll turn to Nicole first as our expert from NOAA, and then I'll add any thoughts I may have.
Yeah, thank you, Jack. So I will start by saying that the trade-offs are going to be difficult to understand. There will always be winners and losers in these kinds of situations. But what we are able to do, just to kind of go back to those statistics that we better understand, we'll be able to better quantify the contributions of the different sectors and ask the questions. If this seawall or whatever this protective measure is going to create problems in another sector, the economic contributions of those sectors is just one way that we can help to measure. Right now, it's very difficult to measure what the trade-offs are going to be. Economics is not everything, and this is why it's very encouraging to see societal benefits and social vulnerabilities brought into this. But if we don't even understand what the economic contribution is of the various sectors, we will be unable to understand those balances.
So I would just add that I think as the gravity of these and the scope of these risks have become more apparent, it's really just going to come down to economics. At that same meeting where I heard a resident of the Norfolk area say, build a seawall, the mayor, who was elected, a Republican mayor, and he, I think, claims that he's the first mayor to mention managed retreats, said, look at our coastline. There is no way, there's no money that we could possibly ever build a kind of seawall to protect the whole city. We're going to have to look at other measures. You look at New York City, I think they have over 500 miles of coast. There's just not enough money that our economy can generate to build this kind of seawalls that people have in the back of their minds, unfortunately still now. So we saw from Karen the maps, the water's going to come in around Florida, and Florida couldn't even build a seawall because of the limestone it rests on. But I think that these trade-offs, as we understand the economic gains from green infrastructure, as well as understand that the cost benefit, the amount of money that we'd have to spend for the hard infrastructure will be out of our reach. We will become much better at choosing selectively where we will need to harden and then look to these green approaches much more widely. I think we're still at the beginning of our understanding, and I still think people want to go back to what they've seen. They've seen a seawall in the past, so they think it'll work now. It's a new world, as we all know, and these changes have never been experienced at this pace by human civilization, so we're going to need new solutions. So I'll turn it back to you, Jack.
Thank you, Alice. Moving to Sally, I have a couple of questions on the CORVI tool. Specifically, how long does it take to run a CORVI assessment in a city? And what kinds of experts do you survey in that coastal city?
Thanks, Jack. That's a great answer. A quick question that I like to answer. When we started, obviously, we put together major data sets and information and collection. It took about 2 years initially, but we've now really shrunk the time frame to about a year. So we can go to 2 cities, and we like to go to cities in a region together for comparative, and it's about a 2-year process. As far as what kind of data sets, as we noted, they're economic, there are employment, there are natural resources about corals and wetlands. There are, as I said, 10 different categories with 100 different data sets. They're really vast. Social. So one of the things I would recommend, so I don't have to spend time going through it all, is go check out our website. We have a very detailed report that we've issued today that has all 100 of the types of data that we are using. And also we're very happy, as all of us I know on the panel are, to talk more about our projects when we have more time.
Thank you, Sally. So a question to Andy now. And this question's about green bonds and the role they play now in the insurance industry and the role they might play in the future. So do you think green bonds will play a larger role moving forward in the insurance industry, specifically for flood risk claims?
Great. There's many different types of green bonds that we can sort of talk about. Perhaps the questions on resilience bonds in terms of raising capital to develop resilient solutions. I think there is an appetite growing on the investment side in the industry around green bonds, resilience bonds. Certainly in Europe, there is more and more discussion around this becoming an important part of an insurance company's investment mandate. Not only do they see the value from the investment side, but it's part of the whole CSR ESG side of the house. So from an insurance point of view, I see the move towards trying to promote this resilience in these communities. Yeah, I can see there being an increase in demand in that in the future. And I think something like CORVI, again, it's how you can articulate the risks that those particular areas are involved to, and then discuss what mitigation techniques can then be implemented and invested in order to reduce that risk and provide that resilience. And I think that investment can then be sourced through capital markets in a way that green bonds and resilience bonds are sort of developing.
Thank you, Andy. So now a question for Karen, and specifically on the coastal DEM dataset. I think I agree with Alice that we were all amazed when it came out and the level of detail it provides and the degree it's reduced our uncertainty about the risk of flooding in coastal areas. This question is about, could you give us some examples of who is using this coastal DEM dataset and specifically how they're using it?
Well, most instances that we know of, it's being used now for risk assessment. It's being used by governments, and governmental entities. It's being used by academics who are studying it. It's being used by companies. My very favorite personal example, however, is that there is a group in, I believe it's Sweden, that is using it as part of an art installation. And we don't yet have details on what that entails, but it is a screening tool. Again, I want to emphasize that. We know there are some places where, as with any big data kind of approach, you're going to get some anomalous results. But really, it dramatically reduces the errors compared to what was available before. We think it's very, very important that if you're going to make investments in resilience, you do so based on the best available information on elevation, so that you don't put resilience or other kinds of infrastructure into areas that are going to be subject to major flooding in the near future. So primarily risk assessment is what it's being used for, which is what it was designed for.
Thank you, Karen. So drilling down to the economics of building coastal climate resilience. Nicole, you spoke about how we now have a much greater picture of the role in which coastal economies play to the national economy of the United States. However, this question delves down into the data gaps which still exist. Specifically, many people who work in the informal economy, for instance, small-scale fishers, still aren't usually counted in these economic statistics. Could you talk about ways in which federal agencies such as NOAA are trying to close this gap?
Yeah, thank you, Jack. So recreational fisheries in the United States are some of the better documented ones with licenses and permits, et cetera. And so their base statistics were included in this analysis. Other parts of the world, that's a very different picture, of course. And as I indicated, infrastructure benefits from the natural world are not a part of these statistics. So there are a lot of gaps. What we very much hope by publicizing the release of these data and the methodologies is that people around the world will provide input and help us identify those gaps. We worked very hard, and the Bureau of Economic Analysis worked very hard to mirror in their methodologies what the types of statistics that are being used in other countries so that they are more comparable. Also in the hopes that the data gaps will be easier to find in that regard. But we do consider this a great start, a first effort. We also know that in the United States, like elsewhere, the indirect contribution to our economy of every product and service that comes through the coastal zone is not counted in these statistics. And so if you're living in Nebraska in the United States and you eat a banana, where do you think that came from, right? And so there are so many places that we can go with these data and these methodologies. We hope this is just a starting point.
Great. Thank you, Nicole. I'm now going to pass it back to our moderator, Alice, so she can wrap up discussion. My apologies for all the questions we didn't get to. But again, this is a continuous discussion, so if you have additional questions, please go to our website or any of the websites of the panelists, where I'm sure you can find their contact information.
Thanks, Jack, and thanks to each of our panelists for this discussion and the very thoughtful questions that we've received. As we wrap this up, in what certainly for me feels like a dark moment, we've got COVID-19, we've talked about climate risk here, and certainly a great unrest in the United States at the moment. So all of us know that we need to hang on to hope, because there is a lot of hope. And there's a lot of reason to be hopeful, as you've heard, as we learn more about how to build resilience. So our sign off here is we want to ask each of our panelists to give one sentence about hope in their field before they depart this session today. So I will start with Andy, if he would give us his sentence of hope.
Thanks, Alice. I think my hope stems from the fact that in a number of panelists have spoken around the value of natural assets and the importance that they play in and going to play in the future around resilience to coastal communities. It's great that that's been identified, and it's great that there is a lot of work going into highlighting that, not only from Nicole's side, but equally the way that we're thinking about it in the industry. So, my bit of hope is that those natural assets, we see the redevelopment of those, and they become a more integral and more valued part of resilience.
That's a great hope, and I share it, and I think it will happen. So, Karen, how about you?
My hope is that the immense opportunity provided by the immense post-COVID stimulus packages that are going to be being done in the United States and many other parts of the world will provide a once in a generation opportunity to make smart investments in resilience and in mitigation.
Share that hope too, and I certainly need to applaud Canada. They require that any large companies who receive bailout money start disclosing their climate risk, which I think will jumpstart the understanding of what needs to get done. So thank you for that, Karen. And Nicole.
I am quite hopeful, given the interdisciplinary, intersocietal, all hands will be affected by sea level rise and climate change. And I think what that has brought to bear is complex, but it means that insurance companies, economists, sociologists, mental health professionals, everyone is hearing the signals, and everyone is starting to really bring their expertise to bear. And that is exciting. It makes for a lot of players. It makes for a lot of cooks in the kitchen. But let me just give you one example for who's taking this seriously. So because of our cooperation with the Department of Defense, they just recently required, it was an edict to all defense installations in the United States, that all future construction and planning will include NOAA's sea level rise projections in them. They are taking this seriously. They have an interest in this. We have an interest in this, and now we are bedfellows in solutions. And so I am hopeful, sadly, that so many different types of people will be affected by this, that people are seeing their interests in this, and they are coming to the table for solutions. And that's very hopeful for me.
That's exciting. Thank you for sharing that. And Sally, I want to turn it over to you and hear your vision for, or where you find hope. And again, just thank you to everyone for joining us today. So Sally?
Thank you, Alice. And thank you to everyone on the panel and everyone who tuned in today. Honestly, I am super jazzed after today. So I have a lot of hope. What an impressive group of panelists that is really showing how government, industry, investors are really trying to work together on a shared goal to reduce climate risk and increase resilience for coastal communities, coastal cities around the world. And what really gets me excited and hopeful is that we're bringing voices of local experts also to the table with all these other groups and entities, as Nicole just talked about. And these tools we've seen, tools such as CORVI that we talked about, Coastal DEM, and I'm particularly excited about the new economic ocean account. That's something we've worked on for almost a decade. And when we bring this together, it really is going to, it's really going to deliver more efficient investments, more effective and tangible results, and at a time when people and communities really, truly need it. I mean, this is an emergency, and it sounds like we really have all hands on deck. So for that, I'm truly hopeful. And let me again thank you, Alice, thank all of our panelists, and everyone who joined today, and take care. Thank you.